As most of you are probably aware by now, the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action on the basis of race at both Harvard and UNC Chapel Hill in a 6-3 decision, with the Republican-appointed justices siding with the plaintiff, Students for Fair Admissions. Now, this decision has come under fire from many Democrats, including President Joe Biden, while being praised by Republicans. Previously on this channel, I've established that I'm a Democrat. I generally hold liberal values and believe in equality, and for those reasons, I support the court's ruling on this case. When it comes to Supreme Court rulings, there's generally two questions I like to ask. One, was the court's ruling constitutional? And two, was the court's ruling ethical? In this video, I'll break both of these questions down. Now, just as a disclaimer, I'm an Asian male who's gone through the college process. I want to make it incredibly clear that I don't blame any of my rejections on affirmative action. Reflecting back on it now, there are definitely more glaring issues with my application than my ethnicity. Starting out with constitutionality, you might be wondering if the court should actually have a say in this matter to begin with. While UNC is a public college and receives significant amounts of federal funding, Harvard is a private university. Shouldn't they get to decide their own admissions practices, even if they're discriminatory? Well, Harvard and many other private universities receive federal grants for a variety of programs, which means that federal anti-discrimination laws apply to them. However, that does mean we're applying different legal provisions to both schools. For UNC, we're working with the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment, whereas with Harvard, we'll be looking at Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. I'll get more into the details of the admissions process when we get into the ethics, but for now, let's work with the simplified understanding that universities are accepting Black students over Asian students who are more qualified on paper with the purpose of creating a more diverse class. With this being the case, it's incredibly clear that this policy violates the Equal Protections Clause. Rejecting qualified students on the basis of their race is discrimination, no matter the reason for doing it. It would be the same if colleges were rejecting Black students in favor of white ones because of their race. It's the same with Title VI, with it stating that no person shall be excluded from participation in or discriminated on by the basis of their race in any program receiving federal financial assistance. The way that affirmative action was handled very clearly violated this, with Asian students not making the cut solely because they were Asian. But I assume that most people aren't really worried about the constitutionality of this case. Or at least that's not what I see most people discussing. Honestly, the more interesting question here is whether this ruling was ethical. Ethics is a subjective thing, so while I have my own opinion on the matter, I want to provide you with all the information you need to come to your own conclusion. Thankfully, this case provided us plenty of details regarding Harvard's admissions process. Harvard rates their applicants on a scale of 1 to 6, with 1 being the highest, on a variety of criteria, being academics, extracurriculars, athletics, and finally, a personal rating. As a brief aside, the athletic rating can only help an applicant, which it only does if you get a 1, which less than 1% of the applicants do. Now, theoretically, the way this would work is that Harvard would rate applicants normally and then choose the ones with the highest overall score. Now, we have an obvious problem here. The details on personality ratings are slim. While each of the numerical scores for the other categories come with descriptions to them, the personal qualities category only comes with a few words per number, with the lowest being race and personal qualities and the highest being outstanding. This is also the hardest category for applicants to receive a 1 in, with the percentage of applicants receiving the rating being less than 0.1%. We do know something though, and it's that when we take a closer look at the data, Asian applicants scored higher than any other race on the academic and extracurricular ratings, but strangely enough, scored the lowest than any other racial group on the personal ratings. Black applicants on the other side ended up with the opposite. The lowest academic ratings, but the highest personal ones. There's an obvious problem with taking this data at face value. For one thing, there's always going to be a race with the lowest average value for any rating. That's just a fact. It doesn't necessarily mean that any given race is worse, it's just something that's going to happen based on the nature of numbers. But there's more to the story here. Harvard, like many other universities, has alumni interviews, in which prospective students actually get to meet a representative from the school and present themselves to them, and the interviewer gets to rate these students. Here's where it gets interesting. The alumni interview ratings didn't match up with those of the admissions council. How affirmative action actually plays into the Harvard admissions process is in that personal rating. Just to further highlight this, here's a graph of the percentage of students receiving that coveted 1 or 2 in the personal rating. Black students didn't just perform a little bit better, they blew Asians out of the water. During his testimony, Peter Arcidiacono, an economist from Duke University, said that if an Asian student with a given set of characteristics has a 25% chance of getting admission to Harvard University, then just by changing his race to white, he would increase his chances to 36%. And if he was Latino or Black, 77% and 95% respectively. I will mention that economist from UC Berkeley, David Card, responded to this by saying that the data was essentially cherry-picked, due to excluding legacies, athletes, and children of staff and faculty. However, personally, I don't buy that that would change the findings too much. Even if we factored that in, I struggle to see why the data that Arcidiacono originally found would be invalidated, but maybe someone in the comments can point that out for me. I do want to be clear though. It's an undeniable fact that Black Americans are disproportionately affected by poverty. Despite the fact that affirmative action is hurting Asian applicants, we can't ignore that this system has put many different roadblocks in front of those disadvantaged individuals. So maybe affirmative action does still have a place? Unfortunately, it was even failing to solve that. A Black student doesn't just mean African American, implying they've descended from slaves. It can also mean just African, or immigrants who've immigrated from Africa by their own free will. These immigrants are far, far wealthier than African Americans, meaning that they'll have an advantage in the process with none of the hardship. It's also not as though there aren't wealthy African Americans either. And this isn't just me making things up either. From Marcia Kono's report earlier, Harvard admits more than twice as many non-disadvantaged African American applicants than disadvantaged African American applicants. Harvard even partially acknowledges this, with their opening statement of the course never mentioning anything about righting past wrongs, but rather just focusing on building a more diverse class. Now, maybe you still feel it's important to have diversity for the sake of diversity at Harvard, but in my opinion, these admissions practices racially discriminate against Asians whilst not even doing what its proponents claim it to do. At the end of the day, I'm happy with this ruling, but if you disagree with me or feel like I left anything out, feel free to leave a comment and I'll do my best to respond. Or if what you say happened to be particularly insightful, I'll pin your comment. Whether or not you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's free, it really helps out the channel, and you can always change your mind later. These conversations are important to have, and I'm always going to keep pushing to find the right and clear answers. Thanks for watching.